I'm a product of your public diplomacy of the 1950s and 60s. And it's a short story, but in 1986, I was a young journalist in Pakistan, and I was at the American Embassy for Thanksgiving dinner. The ambassador at that time decided that everybody who was there will play a game of Trivial Pursuit, which was a new game. Guess who beat all the American diplomats in the game of Trivial Pursuit about American history? So the young man who did that, the ambassador turns to him and he says, "So how long have you been in the US, Husain?" And I turn around and say, "Mr. Ambassador, I've never visited your country. I know all about your country from watching the films, which I have been watching to try and learn English, and reading all the books you have in the American library. And of course, I came into contact with your embassy because I saved that library from being burned down in one of the demonstrations. The police person in charge thought that I would be the right person to put on top of a bus and give a rousing speech to people to tell them that it doesn't make sense under Islam in Islam to burn a library." Of course, I had a vested interest. I was from a poor family. The American library was air conditioned. In summer heat, it was the best place I could go and study while I was at school. You shut all those down. You remember the famous Jesse Helms, Madeleine Albright deal under which USIS was merged into the State Department. They thought, and it usually happens, to save money, the first thing they think about is, how do we cut off these? Oh, this is useless. They're not useless. It's a pleasure being in Boston after a gap of a few years. I like Washington, D.C., not particularly at this moment, but generally. And yet I would say that Boston remains my first love among cities in the United States, except when it is terribly cold, which it sometimes tends to be more often than I wanted it when I lived here. I'm going to try and make this not a very long exposition. These days we are all witnessing a crisis over Qatar, and there is a similarity between the US relationship with Pakistan and with the crisis in Qatar. I will summarize it in one sentence, and that sentence is, how do you deal with someone who is an ally over certain things and refuses to be your partner in other matters? And that's exactly what we are seeing in Qatar. And my observation after a lifetime of dealing with Americans on behalf of Pakistan, and having been caught in a situation in which many Pakistanis say that I was as much an advocate of the US as I was of Pakistan, which I don't see as a criticism but as a compliment, I would say that there is an observation I have about the United States. Americans are a wonderful people. Well, most of them are. And it's a great country. But Americans don't do a couple of things too well. One of them is patience. You just have to see people standing in a line, and sort of if it's moving too slowly, the protests start very quickly over, why isn't this thing moving so much faster? So patience is one of those things. But the other thing Americans don't do too well is history. This is the only country in the world where when you say he's history, what you mean is he's irrelevant. And that is not always the case. History is very relevant in understanding international relations. The United States is only 2 years older as a superpower than the state of Pakistan. Pakistan turns 70 this year after being born in 1947. Actually, it was not like Poland, for example, which existed in history, but it was always an issue of who it will be part of. Pakistan was a totally contrived place, a totally new country, a name that was put together by students at Cambridge University by joining the first letter of the names of the regions that were going to be part of it. P for Punjab, A for Afghania, K for Kashmir, S for Sindh, Tan. So it was like a college project which has now become a country and has nuclear weapons. No wonder Madeleine Albright calls it an international migraine. I don't know how many of you remember, but in 2011, Atlantic came out with a cover story, the title of which was Pakistan, the ally from hell. Why did it happen? I'll go right to the beginning because, as I said, history is important. When Pakistan was created, Pakistan got 19% of British India's population, 17% of its economic resources, but 33% of its army. The reasons, of course, were British colonial policy in erstwhile India. They wanted to recruit people from different religious groups and created a formula whereby the majority, which was the Hindus, would never be a majority of the army. So the Muslims, who were a minority, ended up being 1/3 of the army, even though they were a smaller proportion of the total population. And the Sikhs, who were a very small proportion of the population, ended up being another third. And the Hindus got only 1/3. So that was the British formula for recruitment during the First and the Second World Wars, when they needed large number of troops, cannon fodder, as the British used to call them. And these troops were recruited largely from the area that is now Pakistan. But if you remember, and there are some people in this audience, just a couple, who might be old enough to remember that there was a time when there was an East Pakistan and a West Pakistan. What is today Bangladesh was East Pakistan. So Pakistan was a kind of an anomaly to start out with, a country divided by 1,000 miles, people speaking totally different languages, never having been part of one country before. All of a sudden thrown into one country, joined by nothing else but a shared religion. But on top of it, with a unique situation where they would have a much larger army than economic resources. Because if you get only 17% of the economic resources, 19% of the population, but 33% of the army, it is a country that is destined to become either dominated by the army, or it needed to have wise men, who didn't exist at that time, who could decide what to do with that army, make them stand down, figure out what to do with their pensions, or send them back to the farms. The leaders of Pakistan came up with a unique idea. And that idea was, United States, which had just become a superpower after the end of the Second World War, was not a particularly globally engaged player at that time. If you guys remember, it was the beginning of America actually coming out. America didn't even have embassies in many places in those days. It used to not have a large state department. It didn't have that many people who were considered regional experts in most parts of the world. And Americans, of course, always have a problem with learning foreign languages. We all know the joke about, what do you call somebody who knows one language? Monolingual. What do you call somebody who knows two languages? Bilingual. What do you call somebody who knows many languages? Multilingual. What do you call an American? Well, somebody who's totally dependent on English. And so you didn't have the kind of expertise that you needed when you became the superpower, and you were trying to find allies against communism. Containment of communism had become a policy, and Pakistan played that card very well. Pakistan needed to pay for its army, it needed to pay for its economic development, and it was already deciding what to do, how to shape its identity, and it turned to America. The Americans didn't know Pakistan much, it was new to them. In the beginning, they thought they needed an ally in that region, but the ally that they thought would be more useful to them was India. 70 years later, they are back to thinking the same thing, because it is the bigger potential trading partner, bigger country for investment purposes and business. It has now 70 years later showed that it has been a consistent democracy, so much more in common with America than Pakistan, which has fallen under military rule 4 times in the last 70 years. But Indians were not willing to play ball, because they wanted to be what they called non-aligned. They said, we will take what we need from the Soviet Union, we'll take what we need from the Americans. Pakistanis were eager to court the United States. From 47 to 1952, Pakistan did not have much luck in terms of persuading the Americans that they were the ally in the region, that the Americans needed to shower with money. Then Pakistan's luck turned. Eisenhower got elected president, and his Secretary of State was John Foster Dulles. Dulles did not care about detail. Now, when have we seen that recently? Somebody who doesn't care about details about places, just had a broad emotional kind of view, and his view was, we are going to circle the Soviet Union and the communists with allies and with bases. And so Pakistan's offer that you can come and establish bases, etc., was immediately welcomed. American money started pouring into Pakistan. Pakistan did not give America the bases it wanted. It kind of backtracked, and said, well, we can offer you a secret base for espionage, but nothing more. And that also didn't turn out very lucky, because the very first flight was the one that got shot down, Gary Powers' flight, the U-2 flight. But a belief took root in Washington, D.C., that we want an ally, we need an ally, and we have one. Pakistan's concern, the elite that was trying to form Pakistan, thought that the way to keep people together was to fuel animosity between Pakistan and India. And so, and to play and develop national identity on the basis of religion. So in my first book, I show how three things shaped Pakistan's identity. First was a dependence on Islam as the national unifier, animosity to India as the basis for keeping it as a nation, and then third, total dependence on the United States and its alliances as a way of paying for the bills. 70 years, fast forward, let's come to today. In between, there's a lot of detail. We all know that Henry Kissinger went to China through Pakistan. We know details like the Afghan jihad against the Soviet Union, where Pakistan was important, etc. But we also know Pakistan broke promises with the US, built nuclear weapons with the US, didn't want it to, and then Pakistan continued with the jihad after the Americans left Afghanistan for its own purposes, primarily to try and get advantage in Kashmir with India. And now, where do we stand? Well, where we stand is that Pakistan has received $45 billion in American aid since 1953. One of the largest recipients, in fact, possibly the largest recipient of American assistance in the world, barring Israel. Certainly one of the biggest recipients of military assistance. With that much money, what has Pakistan been able to accomplish? Well, it has become a nuclear power, the sixth nuclear weapons power in the world, sixth biggest nuclear arsenal in the world, sixth largest military in the world. But in everything else, Pakistan is lagging behind. Its GDP ranks at number 41 out of 217 countries and territories in the world. So it has the smallest GDP of any country, barring North Korea, the smallest GDP of any country with nuclear weapons. Its GDP on a PPP basis is 27th out of 190. Its GDP per capita is 171st out of 230 countries and territories. There's something called the Human Development Index that measures a country's performance in social indicators. And there Pakistan is at number 147 out of 188. So sixth largest nuclear arsenal, but lagging behind in everything else. Its primary education is ranked at 126 out of 140. In 1947, what is today Pakistan had a literacy rate of 11%. What is today India had a literacy rate of 12%, a 1% difference. Today India's literacy rate is 78%, Pakistan's is lagging behind at 53 to 58 depending on which way you measure it. So what was a 1% difference has become a 20% difference. Pakistan has gone to war with India 4 times, almost always with American weapons, and still not succeeded in changing the status quo in Kashmir since 1948. Pakistan's passport is now ranked as one of the worst passports in the world, alongside the passport of Afghanistan. You can go to more countries without a visa on a North Korean passport than you can go on a Pakistani passport. So you can imagine how bad things must be for that situation to have emerged. Osama bin Laden was found in Pakistan, which created a lot of problems. I served as ambassador at that time, and I'm expecting somebody to ask me a question about that, so I'm not going to go into the details right now. That can be the shortest question, by the way, if somebody composes it in their head right now. And so, why did this all happen? In my book, Magnificent Delusions, I say Pakistan's whole enterprise, that it will somehow, with American assistance, become India's military equal and will keep building up its military at the expense of everything else, was a delusion. Even after doing all that, it was like somebody who just exercises one arm and lets the rest of his body atrophy. And so Pakistan did do that, ended up building that muscle. It does have a very big military, but what good are nuclear weapons going to be against jihadis inside the country who are virtually taking over society, Pakistani society? playing the religion card has actually divided Pakistan instead of uniting it, because originally all Muslims thought of themselves as, okay, we want to be Pakistanis. Now they're divided between Shia and Sunnis, and then Ahmadis and other denominational differences. Whenever you play the religious card, denominational differences will eventually crop up. It's not going to be something that you can set aside. Conflict with India. Pakistan has not been able to win. At the same time, while Pakistan has juggled it well, in terms of getting money from the United States for ostensibly for purposes that the Americans needed, like fighting the communists. Pakistan never gave troops to fight in Vietnam or Korea, etc., just dangled it, but never kept the promise. Was able to get nuclear weapons by promising, it was helping against the Soviets in Afghanistan, which it did. And then subsequently, since 9/11, getting lots of money on the basis of we are trying to fight the extremists. We need your assistance for that. So all of that still hasn't provided the base for Pakistan to become stable and strong. What was the US's mistake in all of this? Well, the US's mistake was that it didn't see through Pakistan's game early enough. Because in 1953, there was excitement. Dulles went to Pakistan. Pakistan promised him that we will join your alliance. He came back. He had a very famous dinner, which I narrate in my book, with Walter Lippmann. And Lippmann was critical. Lippmann and many others were very critical of the US becoming an ally of Pakistan and making it join their military alliance, saying Pakistan is not, first of all, in Southeast Asia, because they have made it join the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. So how can you have Pakistan as part of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization when it's geographically not located there? And secondly, its main fight is with someone that America doesn't have a fight with, which is India. So why are we arming them? So Lippmann used to say that. So they both ran into each other at a party, and some journalist heard it all and recorded it in one of the books about Lippmann. And the conversation is very interesting. It's interesting because it tells you why World Boston is so important and organizations like it are so important. I'll explain the importance later, but first the story. So John Foster Dulles walks up to Lippmann and says, "Look here, Walter, why are you criticizing our alliance with Pakistan?" Lippmann turns around and says, "Because I can't understand it. Why do you have it? It's not a Southeast Asian country, and you've made them part of the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization." Foster says, "Look here, we need fighting men in the south of Asia. And I'm told by the British that the only people who know how to fight in South Asia are the Gurkhas." So Lippmann pauses and says, "But Foster, the Gurkhas are not Pakistanis." So he says, "Oh, really? Well, but they're Muslims, aren't they?" And he says, "No, I don't think they're Muslims either. They are Hindus." Now, as we all know, the Gurkhas come from Nepal, and they are Hindus, have nothing to do with Pakistan or with Islam. So what do you think Dulles said? I would have been very embarrassed in that situation, but some people are greater than people like you and me. So he wasn't embarrassed. He just turned around and he said, "We need an ally to fight the communists. We've got an ally. Thank God for it. Don't get into the minor details." That's what went wrong. At different times, what America was doing, or the American strategic planners were doing, was they were always thinking about how they could fit Pakistan with this large army into their plans without spending some time in figuring out what is the other side's plan, for God's sake. What do they want from us? And so today, Pakistan is seen, by and large, not as favorably disposed to the United States. Poll after poll shows that an overwhelming majority of Pakistanis has a negative view of the US. Unfortunately, after the Bin Laden episode, an overwhelming majority of Americans has a negative view of Pakistan as well. Almost 80% of Americans have an unfavorable view of Pakistan. Pakistan is seen as a militarist and militant state. If I was to ask any of you, what is your impression of Pakistan, you would say, "I have a Pakistani dentist up in Newton, but other than that, who's very nice, but other than that, I think the country kind of is going down the tube with all the stories of terrorists and jihadis collecting money in the streets and nuclear weapons being not completely under control and constant bickering and fighting with Afghanistan and India and even Iran now, and then becoming an ally of China. So after 70 years of being totally dependent on the US and seeking American aid, Pakistan is now turning to China, and we are about to make the same mistake with China, that China will pour in money, millions or billions of dollars, and that will somehow keep us afloat. It does keep a country afloat, but it does not make a proper normal economy. Just to give you an insight, the biggest aid recipient in that region, Pakistan, is a smaller trading partner for the United States than Sri Lanka, which is many times smaller. There are fewer students from Pakistan studying in American universities this year than have come from Nepal, which is a much poorer and much smaller country. Many of us, and I am quite happy to say that and acknowledge that, we are a wonderful people. Pakistanis that you know are probably very charming, bright, intelligent, but we belong to a very small elite in a country of 200 million people. And so the small elite and its pride in its and their achievement notwithstanding, the country as a whole has not performed well. And the American pouring of resources has not helped. Compare that, say, for example, with South Korea. Guess how much aid the United States poured into South Korea, considering how South Korea has now become an important economic player in the world? $10 billion. Taiwan, 15 billion. Pakistan, 45 billion. True, bigger population. But Pakistan in 1971, when it split between East and West Pakistan and East Pakistan became Bangladesh, Bangladesh was in population more numerous, West Pakistan was smaller. Bangladesh was poorer than West Pakistan. And today, well, today Bangladesh's stock market has a higher market capitalization than the stock market in Pakistan. Their exports are much more than the exports of Pakistan. Pakistan is a major producer of cotton in the world. But when it comes to the value of textile exports, the country that has greater value-added textile exports is Bangladesh, not Pakistan. What they do is they buy yarn from Pakistan or cloth from Pakistan, turn it into garments. Why are they able to do that? They have a more literate workforce. So a lot of these women who are seamstresses, they sit in large, big warehouses. There are other problems associated with that, but they produce shirts and garments that are sold internationally, increasing the country's earnings, whereas Pakistan is still at that earlier level of producing cotton and yarn and basic level of cloth and occasionally towels and nothing more. Why has that happened? I think that the United States' willingness to only focus on the Pakistani military as an ally has alienated the people of Pakistan. Secondly, it has built up the military but has not built up the country. And third, it has not served America's interests either. Through the 60s and 70s, Americans complained the Pakistanis weren't doing enough to fight the communists alongside the Americans. Now they are complaining that the Pakistanis are not doing enough to support the American effort in Afghanistan or against the jihadis. My view is that the United States, in terms of the Dulles theory of we've got an ally, so we should be grateful to God, makes a mistake in making allies that it does not fully understand. And alliances should always be based on on a shared interest, not just a bureaucratic requirement. So these days, when I meet my State Department friends who say, well, Ambassador Haqqani, don't you think we have a shared interest with Pakistan that we need to supply our troops in Afghanistan through Pakistan? I said, that's not a shared interest. That's just a bureaucratic or technical need. You could figure out another way of supplying them as well. Shared interest is the big thing you want, is it the same as the big thing they want? And maybe Pakistan did want the defeat of communism, but it didn't want it it wasn't as significant to them as it was to the United States. And similarly, the defeat of jihadi terrorism is not necessarily as important to Pakistan today as it is to the United States. On the other hand, Pakistan wants to defeat India, which America is certainly not interested in. So alliances based on shared interests is the big picture. Why did I say that organizations like World Boston have a contribution to make, or for that matter, the schools of international relations in this country? I think that to be able to understand what your foreign policy ought to be, you also need to understand what do the others really want. The biggest success in American foreign policy was containment of the Soviet Union. It was a multi-year bipartisan policy. How did it succeed? It started with a single telegram, that long telegram of George Kennan. What was the genius of that telegram? I've read it many, many times. I've taught it in my classes many times when I was teaching. The genius of that telegram was that George Kennan laid out what he thought was the Soviet mind. What do they think? What do they want? Where are they headed? How is that a threat to American interests, and how can that be contained? I think that in dealing with mid-level and smaller countries, Americans don't always do that right. There is a presumption that because you are meeting a nice elite, and by the way, I could go on and on, but I won't. I'll end on time. Iran, people talk about how Iran was a mistake, installing the Shah, trusting him completely, not understanding what else was going on in Iran, and then losing Iran to the mullahs. Well, again, not understanding the internal dynamic was the big flaw. So where do things stand today? Well, Pakistan still says it wants to fight the terrorists alongside the Americans, but the evidence is not overwhelming. Pakistan is not supporting the American war effort in Afghanistan. Pakistan still continues to send terrorists into Jammu and Kashmir, over which it has a dispute with India, but also into India and into Afghanistan. And a lot of jihadis still manage to come through Pakistan, because once you have one organization that you say, we are supporting you to wage jihad in Kashmir and in India, but please don't go ahead and cause trouble in England or France. You think they're going to believe that? These are believers. So they are going to, once they have got the training, their training can manifest in many places. We all remember the Times Square bomber who had been trained in Pakistan. Thank God he didn't succeed. This recent bombing in London, recent terrorist attack with stabbings, etc. in London, one of the persons comes from Pakistan. Pakistan has to get rid of that problem for its own sake. I'm a Pakistani, and I think Pakistan needs to pay more attention to raising that literacy level that it has ignored for the sake of building nuclear weapons. Because at the end of the day, nuclear weapons may help you deter aggression, but they do not help you in any other way. And my analogy of the man who has just been building one muscle and ignoring the rest of his body stands. As far as the US is concerned, the US needs to understand when that's happening and not get into the process of helping that, giving him more weights to lift, giving him those specialized steroids that will build that one particular muscle and ignore the rest of his being. And I think that right now, the US is in a bit of a policy freeze, because except Twitter, most of the world does not get the kind of attention that it ought to, and so far there hasn't been significant attention paid to Pakistan and Afghanistan. General Mattis yesterday declared that he was not that optimistic about the prospect of a negotiated settlement involving the Pakistani-backed Taliban in Afghanistan. Let us see what comes out of all of this. But for the foreseeable future, I do not see the old paradigm of Pakistan is an ally because it says so working in US-Pakistan relations. I'm going to stop here and give you guys an opportunity to ask those questions and, of course, win that prize for the succinct question that Mary is offering. Thank you.
Ambassador, could you identify 2 or 3 areas that would be mutually beneficial to the U.S. and Pakistan in establishing something that will lift Pakistan and be useful to the U.S. as well in the next 20 years?
Well, I think that Pakistan and the United States need to develop what I call normal relations, which is not an aid-based relationship, but a trade-based relationship, a relationship of normal exchange again, not just totally dependent on. So the number of students that come from Pakistan need to increase because Pakistanis feel the need to study in the United States, not because of a few dozen or a few hundred fellowships or Fulbrights given by the US. Those are good, but the Pakistanis need to feel that need as well. So that would be an area. And then if Pakistan can actually make up its mind, which it hasn't been able to do, partly because our military still thinks that the jihadis add to its firepower. It's a low-cost, sub-conventional instrument of bleeding India. If Pakistan does make a decision that it is truly turning away from this whole enterprise of jihad, which many people understand. Look, America was involved in it. You supported the Mujahideen, etc., but you realize this is not forever. And so if Pakistan can make that decision, then that would be another thing in which Pakistan and the United States could cooperate. And providing some security for the region stretching from the Arabian Sea all the way into the Indian Ocean towards Africa, that could be another. If Pakistan understands that that's what it should be doing rather than constantly threatening India.
Yes, right behind Raul, right there.
So kind of speaking to that, what you just said, I think when it comes to international relations, especially under our current administration, that's something that's not talked about on a local level. So there's less incentive for people in Pakistan to want to come and study here because they might be thrown out of the country thanks to, a ban that was just, it was in fact declared a ban by our own president. So is there a way to both, what are the incentives to come here in this current administration? What are the incentives for American to educate themselves more on why we need to have these diplomatic relationships? I'm sure you could speak to that because your diplomatic relationship helped us to bring down Osama bin Laden. And if we don't have a lot of positions that haven't been appointed yet, and we don't have these relationships, we're losing our strength.
Well, your question has a component that is actually not just about diplomatic relations, it's about engagement of your own polity. I was just talking to Mary earlier and saying that this country has become too partisan, too polarized. Too many people making decisions on the basis of whose side they're on rather than what is correct. And so therefore, and then substantive discussion has eroded. I mean, cable television, there's a liberal channel and then there's a conservative channel. So basically everybody is getting involved into their own little bubbles. And because they're in bubbles, therefore, foreign policy, which was never, as I pointed out, even in 52, 53, it wasn't substantially and thoughtfully made. I mean, the president says Pakistan's our ally, everybody believes it's our ally, because how many people could actually have gone there, and known about it. And so, informed polity is very important. And your generation, I hope, will go beyond, Justin Bieber's antics getting 12 million sort of likes is one thing. But what the heck is happening in the world also needs to go up to 12 million or 20 million or 27 million young people actually seeing. So the young people have to become engaged. There was a generation in this country that actually understood the importance of what happened in the rest of the world only when they were about to be conscripted for the Vietnam War. That's when they started thinking about what really is the world about? Why is it happening? Why am I about to be sent to fight? Now that there is no conscription, the young people, and I used to teach here, I often said to a lot of young people that, you seem to have no interest in what goes on in the world. Voting patterns are another revelation. Young people vote much less than older ones do. So that's your domestic component. As far as the business of creating incentives for understanding the world, I think circumstances do it. And it's about to happen. I think that the economic consequences of ignoring the world, the consequences to individuals and people, already For Pakistanis, I mean, a lot of people who support my point of view in Pakistan, and I can't go back to Pakistan right now because of environment, but I do say a lot. And I have a lot of people there who support my position. And those who support my position, many of them feel this, because these young people who would like to, I mean, there are many young people all over the world who want, and Pakistan has a very young population. 2/3 of the population is below the age of 20. And so there are these young people who feel, gosh, we can't travel anywhere. And I tell them stories like, on YouTube or something, and I say, hey, when I was 18, I was able to travel to like 12 countries. In my first trip, I went without a visa. I just got a passport and a couple of $100, and I made it. So then they feel very, hey, what's wrong? How do we change that? And so that's happening there. Something like that needs to happen here as well. As far as travel bans, etc., look, we all understand how creating fear is always the easiest way to respond to outsiders and foreigners. And that's been happening here, that's happening in other parts of the world as well. Eventually, it will come, it will sort itself out for practical necessities. Russia, which is a very xenophobic country, will have to come to terms one day with the fact that it is actually losing population. And so when you're losing population, what do? You need people to work. And where are they going to come from? They're not going to come from, look at the demographic map of the world. Where are new children being born, and where is population rising? And where is it falling? So Japan, Russia, both of them, very, shall we say, exclusive nations. Xenophobic is a bit judgmental, so I'll use a non-judgmental term. Exclusive nations, they will have to come to terms with the prospect of immigration. Now, Europeans were very Eurocentric, etc., until after the Second World War. Why do you think there are Turks in Germany? They didn't go there, to see the sights after the Second World War and then decided to stay on. They went there as guest workers because Germany, while rebuilding, didn't have enough men of working age to do the construction jobs, etc. So soon you will hear a counter argument being built within this society. The companies, the corporations, the businesses that need immigration, that need trained manpower from other countries, they will be the ones who will then invest, because that's how this country works. Somebody has to throw in the money to be able to get people to talk about something, and then they will all be saying, hey, this was a big mistake, we made a huge mistake, we need to fight terrorism, but then let's not throw the baby out with the bath water. We need to have economic growth as well, and we need people for all of that. And I think we'll come to that. It'll take some time, and if it can be done sensibly and thoughtfully, so much the better. Unfortunately, history teaches us that everything is not done as a result of thoughtful decisions. Sometimes it's a series of blunders that teaches people the correct lesson.
A variety of public diplomacy programs, such as professional exchanges and educational exchanges, with which Boston is very involved in. And that barely moved the needle. Pakistan and Afghanistan were our two largest public diplomacy programs in the world in that period. Now, the transactional nature of the two countries' relationship and American drone strikes continuing over a long period of time did help things. But what do you see? And I know you've written extensively in terms of what went wrong in terms of favorability, but what do you see are the tools and strategies that can improve greater understanding between the two peoples, not leave aside the governments?
So quick answer to this one. Look, when you say it barely moved a needle, what you're doing is you're planting a seed and saying, why is the tree not giving fruit tomorrow? This is one of those slow-moving things. So you'll have to do it over a long, sustained period. I'm a product of your public diplomacy of the 1950s and 60s. And it's a short story, but in 1986, I was a young journalist in Pakistan, and I was at the American Embassy for Thanksgiving dinner. The ambassador at that time decided that everybody who was there will play a game of Trivial Pursuit, which was a new game. Guess who beat all the American diplomats in the game of Trivial Pursuit about American history? So the young man who did that, the ambassador turns to him and he says, so how long have you been in the US, Husain? And I turn around and say, Mr. Ambassador, I've never visited your country. I know all about your country from watching the films, which I have been watching to try and learn English, and reading all the books you have in the American library. And of course, I came into contact with your embassy because I saved that library from being burned down in one of the demonstrations. The police person in charge thought that I would be the right person to put on top of a bus and give a rousing speech to people to tell them that it doesn't make sense under Islam to, in Islam to burn a library. Of course, I had a vested interest. I was from a poor family. The American library was air conditioned. In summer heat, it was the best place I could go and study while I was at school. You shut all those down. You remember the famous Jesse Helms Madeleine Albright deal under which USIS was merged into the State Department. They thought, and it usually happens, to save money, the first thing they think about is, how do we cut off these? Oh, this is useless. They're not useless. That's what produced. So I would argue that if somebody seriously thought about it, the library in Karachi, whatever money was spent on it from the year 1964, which is the first time I went there as an 8-year-old, to 1986, bore fruit in 2011 when a young Pakistani student who had studied in that library had grown into becoming Pakistan's ambassador to the US and was able to fight all the various interests in Pakistan in making sure that the Americans had the capability and the capacity to be able to find bin Laden. Of course, lawfully under Pakistani law, all the help that I gave was, none of it was breaking Pakistani law. But my point is that friendship actually was not just a diplomat comes into my house and shakes hands and say, Mr. Ambassador, can you do this? You had planted that seed by having that library in Karachi.
I was probably in that library at the same time as you. I was the cultural officer at the consulate in Karachi from 86 until 88.
Right. So I'm just saying that so look on those things as that. I think it'll be a generational effect much later. There's no quick fix to that one.
Okay,
When you go out,
please go ahead, Michael,
yes,
and then
thank
we'll
you,
go to
thank
Heather.
you. When you go out of the United States and come back in, do you get hassled at airports?
I'm a lucky one. I have not yet been hassled, but a lot of my friends and family members are hassled. I was hassled earlier on, right after 9/11, but not as bad as some of the stories I hear. So it's probably the draw of the luck, but hassling people serves no security purpose. I will tell you a story. I'm a Pakistani passport holder. The Pakistani passport says in big letters, it's not valid for Israel. Pakistan is one of those hardline countries against Israel. I happen to be invited to Israel to go for as an election observer for the Palestinian elections. I had to go to Israel for that. The Israeli embassy gave me a visa on a blank sheet of paper. I went on an El Al flight. You would think that a Muslim coming from a country that doesn't recognize Israel, that is not, has no relationship with it, etc., and consider it, as a source of terror and fear, they would hassle more. No, everybody. They asked me 20 questions, but each of them very polite and rationally. While boarding the flight, checked my bag very methodically, gave me my passport, said, why don't you go and sit and have a cup of coffee or something and come back just before the flight, put me on the plane very calmly, asked a couple of questions, sent a cable beforehand saying, hey, there's an unusual one coming, he's got a Pakistani, but we've cleared him, he's fine, we've given him a visa, he's fine. The point is that this tendency to save, you see there's an expression I learned very early in my life, penny wise and pound foolish. The pound being the British pound, which is not that relevant anymore in global currency. But sometimes you invest in things, you refuse to invest in things that you can. How difficult is it to keep profiles of people into computers, etc., etc., and you're looking for a few hundred, few thousand. Okay, You don't want anybody to get through. But harassing average, ordinary people is not the solution to the problem. You can create profiles, and people who fit the profile, harass them as much as you have to. Again, try not to harass them, deal with them methodically for the purpose that you want to deal with them. And basically smart solutions rather than sort of, ham-handed solutions. And unfortunately, we live in a world overall, everywhere, where ham-handedness is easier than smart solutions.
Okay. So, we need to.
Hi, Ambassador Haqqani. Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. In thinking about creating common interests to benefit both the U.S. and Pakistan, the U.S.-India Chamber of Commerce is a very powerful lobby and a great way for both of our countries to create common interests. And I'm wondering, is there, excuse my ignorance, but is there a U.S.-Pakistan Chamber of Commerce? And if there's not, could that not be a great?
There is, and when I was ambassador, it was very, very active because I activated it. I worked very hard on it because I believed in it. However, it doesn't fit the pattern of the relationship, because when Pakistan isn't the destination of large American investments except a few consumer good companies. So Coke is there, Procter & Gamble is there, but the big ones have all started, kind of have all since over the years slowly pulled out. And when it's not a big trading destination and the two-way trade is not high, then the chamber kind of becomes less significant than it ought to be. But it does exist.
What we can learn from history, I think, is kind of a perspective. So some of us have been around long enough. I say, like, I'm old enough, been around long enough to have known that this feeling of hopelessness we have now is what Albert Hirschman called fracasomania in the 1960s in Latin America. He said fracasomania was a failure complex about development. He said people in the region had this incredible failure complex. Everything is going wrong. And he said even at a time when Latin America is growing at a pretty brisk pace, right? But because it wasn't the kind of growth people desired, there wasn't enough growth with equity, there was a sense of a failure complex. So the failure complex we have today, I think, is not a new phenomena, and that may provide some perspective.